唔好意思，要大家等咗一陣。
Sorry for the wait. Welcome to today's press briefing. The advisory panel on COVID-19 vaccines held a meeting this afternoon. We have with us today the convener of the advisory panel, Professor Wallace Lau, and Professor David Hui. Professor Lau will first brief you on the outcome of today's meeting, followed by a Q&A session. Right, first of all, let me apologize for the delay. We had a very long deliberation. Today we held a meeting. Of course, everybody knows why. This is in relation to COVID-19 vaccines and the CoronaVac or COVID-19 virus Sinovac or Verocell, which is an inactivated virus vaccine developed by Sinovac, has applied for approval for emergency use in Hong Kong. In the past 2 days, the advisory panel on COVID-19 vaccines received a lot of data from the Sinovac company, including phase 1 and 2 clinical trial data in terms of the efficacy and safety on different groups of subjects. We had a detailed discussion just now, and we found that in terms of phase 1, phase 2 clinical trial data, we find the efficacy and safety of CoronaVac acceptable. Now, we also have phase 3 clinical trial data available. We understand that clinical trial of phase 3 has been conducted in a number of countries, including Brazil on a larger scale, and also Turkey and Indonesia. We discussed these 3 studies, the efficacy and the possible side effects and the number of cases involved. We really had a lengthy discussion. We are of the view that in terms of phase 3 clinical data, the vaccine is effective, and we also actively conducted an analysis on the efficacy of the vaccine. Eventually, we agreed in our deliberation that this vaccine is safe and it is effective. In terms of phase 3 study in Brazil, the outcome shows that the risk of getting infected with COVID-19 would be minimized. However, 2 issues stem from our deliberations. We'd like Sinovac to give us more information on these 2 matters. First, on administering the vaccine, we understand it has a 2-dose regimen, starting with day 1 and then either day 14 or day 28, depending on different studies. We'd like to find out whether there is any difference in terms of efficacy on the 14th day or the 28th day when the second dose is administered. We'd like to have data on this. Second, for those inoculated, we'd like to find out the onset rate for these subjects, and as an indicator, whether these subjects would have antibodies. And we'd like to have more data from Sinovac as well. In the coming 2 weeks, as we all know, as Chinese New Year is approaching, we will be collecting data from Sinovac, such that in 2 weeks' time, the advisory panel will hold another meeting to review the data that I just mentioned. By then, we can take a proactive approach and make recommendations to the Secretary for Food and Health. Professor Hui, anything to add? Not for the time being. All right, so the floor is open. Please state the media organization that you represent before you put your question. This one on the right in black. I'm from Hong Kong 01, TMHK. Well, you mentioned that you reviewed the efficacy and safety of CoronaVac. It is acceptable, but WHO will not review CoronaVac before March. So in other words, Hong Kong will go one step ahead of WHO in possibly granting approval for the use of CoronaVac. And Mrs. Carrie Lam said that overseas authorities' approval would also be used as reference, and the national or the NMPA, National Medicinal Product Administration, has given approval. Will this serve as a reference as well? Well, there is no peer review literature available for CoronaVac. If later on in the global community there is no such approval, whereas in Hong Kong, depending on the data received, we have given approval, will we continue to use CoronaVac? Third question about availability of data. At the moment, we've only received data from the Brazil clinical trial, not the clinical trials in Turkey and Indonesia. Why is it that despite the insufficient data available, you can make this preliminary determination that it is safe, effective, with little side effect? Let me say first and foremost that our review of the data is based on empirical evidence. In the previous week's discussion, the focus has been on whether the data should be published in medical literature before we should review the data. Now, I'd like to stress that the 12 members sitting on our advisory panel are all experts, and their work has also been published in renowned international medical journals. We'll also review the articles and pursuant to these reviews, whether these articles should be published in journals. Say, for example, if somebody applies for an article to be published, we'll check the data and check the accuracy and reliability. So let me reassure you that we take a scientific approach, and we believe the WHO also takes the same approach. Now, whether or not we should wait for the WHO's decision, I would say that the most important thing is to have scientific backing. Apart from mainland China, which gave approval for use of this vaccine last week, we also have a number of countries, including Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, and Chile, authorizing the use of the vaccine. So let me just repeat that we abide by a scientific regime in reviewing the data. For phase 3 clinical trial, we have data from 3 countries, Brazil, Turkey, and Indonesia, and we have reviewed the data of these 3 countries. We, of course, take a very close look at these 8 countries as well.
From RTH News, 2 questions. First, whether the views among experts on the panel are divided over whether the vaccine should be used, and any expert has opposed to it. And the second question is why the information needed from Sinovac has not been submitted earlier, whether examining a medical journal is enough to conclude its safety. Thank you.
Okay, a relatively easy question. Thank you very much. First of all, the decision or that I have just announced has been arrived at actually by the whole panel, all 12 members actually agree on the approach that I have just highlighted earlier on. As to why Sinovac has not submitted data earlier, I'm afraid I am unable to answer that question. Based on the data that we have got, I mean, they actually have submitted quite complete data. But we do want to, as I mentioned earlier on, actually clarify a couple of things with them. The panel, the panel's views, are we divided? No.
好，下一個提問。
Next question, please. Good afternoon from Sunbo. So now it seems that we don't need to wait for it to be published on the international journal, and that as long as the advisory panel believes that it is all right, then CoronaVac could be used. Would that mean that you are lowering the threshold? And are you setting a new baseline that when you are reviewing a fourth or a fifth vaccine, you don't have to wait for the data to be published in the international journal? Could you also tell us about the review of the AstraZeneca vaccine? Let me answer the easier question first. For any vaccine companies that apply for the vaccine to be used in emergency, then only then we look at the data. So it doesn't apply to AstraZeneca as it hasn't applied for emergency use. In relation to the reviewing of the vaccines, we would look at whether the company could provide us with a complete set of data. Of course, we welcome data that has already been published. Currently, we do not yet see phase 3 clinical data published. However, CoronaVac's efficacy in phase 1 and 2 of clinical trial has already been published. Many of our members submit to these medical journals, and we would also base our decision on these literature. We are going to base our decisions on all the scientific data that we see. Well, we can only take the last two questions because there's going to be another press briefing after this. Good afternoon from Cable TV. Previously, the advisory panel has stated that they would only approve a vaccine when it has been published in international journals. Why would you then approve one that has not yet been published? Is it because you heard what the chief executive said yesterday, that it must comply with the 3 requirements and then it could be approved? It seems that the standards have now changed and you have lowered the benchmark. Would that instill less confidence in the public because they might think that there is a higher risk to take this vaccine? If you do not mind me reiterating, I would like to emphasize that all 12 members of the advisory panel on COVID-19 vaccines are very confident in the vaccine, and we don't have to wait for it to be published in the international journal. We have had a very long discussion over 3 hours, and then we are going to also to send publish this information on medical journals as soon as possible. Last question, please. Good afternoon from Economic Times. I'd like to ask Professor Lau a question. You said that you were going to require Sinovac to provide more data on immunity. Does it mean that right now you do not see any high immunity level after taking the vaccine, and would it also affect the pace in which the vaccine could be provided? Well, we hope that will not affect the speed in which we can set off our vaccine program. As for data on immunity, I'm not saying that we do not believe them. I'm just said earlier that we hope that we could have all the scientific evidence before we set this off. We hope we'll be able to make a decision within 2 weeks. What if you're not able to achieve that within 2 weeks? Well, we hope that Sinovac will be able to provide us with the information within 2 weeks. Well, let me add on to it. In phase 1 and 2 of the clinical trial literature, it seems that the vaccine taken after the second dose taken after 28 days actually has a higher protection rate. So now we are now reviewing whether the second dose should be taken after 14 days or after 28 days. Sinovac provided the information that if it's a 20-day gap, then the efficacy rate is 62%. If it's 14-day, then it's 50.5%. So we want to see when is it best to take the second dose. I'll allow 2 more questions, but could you please wait for the microphone? Do you mean to say that we still do not know about the immune response in phase 3 of the clinical trial? We keep on saying that we need to wait for phase 3 clinical trial results. Why is that you would still decide it as an effective vaccine even though the data is not produced? And if it's not published in an international journal, so what kind of other data would you request, and what kind of evidence would you base your decision on? Thank you. Oh, I'm from Singtao.
Let me answer the first question. As I mentioned just now, for phase 1, phase 2 clinical data, they've been published in Lancet, the medical journal. And it seems that if there is an interval of 28 days for the 2 doses, the antibody levels may be higher. For phase 3 clinical study, I believe that data is available, but at the moment they haven't submitted the set of data to us. That is why we are requiring supplementary information. Speaker is not coming through. Otherwise, members of the public won't understand why sometimes publication in a medical journal is necessary, sometimes not. Well, if you don't mind, allow me to be a bit long-winded. As I mentioned just now, in order to consider the application, we follow the procedure as we do in an article to be published in a medical journal. The speaker is not coming through. The speaker is not using a microphone. For data in phases 1, 2, and 3, let me reiterate in terms of safety of the vaccine and antibody level, data are available in phases 1 and 2. Now, according to these studies, in various studies, in fact, there is antibody response in over 90% of the subjects inoculated. So we believe that the immunity response will be generated after vaccination. But as I said just now, in order to consider whether an article should be published in a medical journal, we conduct a review in a particular manner, namely whether the data are available. I don't know whether I've explained myself clearly. Frankly, just now some other journalists already mentioned that it comprises over 1,000 pages in different languages, in other words. So at least several hundred pages to wade through. It doesn't just say in simple percentage terms how many people have or have not the antibody or the virus. There are details as to, for example, groups, subgroups, the number of subjects, the inoculation rate, the procedures in detail, many figures and details which we reviewed. Speaker's not coming through. So what's your question again? The speaker's not coming through. The speaker is not using a microphone. All I can say is that we reviewed data just now, as we did for BioNTech or other vaccine manufacturers which published articles in medical or applied for an article to be published in a medical journal. We reviewed the data in the same manner. Last question. I'm from Stan News. You mentioned that it is effective in lowering the risk. What is the basis of your decision? Is it based on phase 1 and 2 data, even in the absence of the phase 3 trial report, you still have the same conclusion? Is that the case? Or is it that despite not having the antibody level data available, you still believe it is effective? Next question. About Sinopharm, has it applied for its vaccine to be used on an emergency basis in Hong Kong? Has there been any discussion? Next question, you mentioned that your advisory panel has experts. So without international recognition, you now approve this vaccine to be used on an emergency basis. And Mrs. Carrie Lam also said that nobody should be personally liable for the decision. Then if something goes wrong, if there are adverse events, will anyone be liable? Well, let me clarify. We're not suggesting there is no antibody response. We just want to have data in relation to that. In reviewing the efficacy of a vaccine, the most reliable method is to review the number of subjects administered with the vaccine or placebo group and checked how many of them have been infected. The speaker is not coming through. Yes, phase 3 data are available. Among 9,823 subjects inoculated, about 200 of them are symptomatic. Nucleic tests have been conducted, and some 160 subjects had placebos instead. So you can calculate the overall protection rate, which is 50.65%. Thank you. Speakers not coming through. The speaker or speakers are not using microphone. We have another press briefing. The speaker or speakers are not coming through.
不如係阿教授可唔可以答埋佢？
Professor, how about the last question? Speaker is not coming through. The speaker is not using a microphone. The speaker is not coming through. First of all, a simple answer, we haven't heard from them. No contact. On the point of liability, the 12 members appointed understand that we are committed and we do our work based on scientific evidence. And we do our work in terms of reviewing the data available. We believe that this is the most appropriate way in our review. Nobody has a crystal ball whether we would be making a mistake or not. At the moment, we're all dedicated to our work. Are you talking about criminal liability or otherwise? The speaker is not using a microphone. The speaker is not using a microphone. Of course, after reviewing the data, if we find it suitable, we will make a decision, and of course, we will be liable or responsible for the decision we make. Thank you. The speaker is not coming through. A reporter asked just now whether there is any difference in opinions among the 12 members. The answer is no. That's right. The speaker is not coming through. The speaker from the floor is not using a microphone. Let me just say a few more words. As I mentioned just now, all 12 members are very committed to reviewing the data, and we believe our expertise would be able to determine the reliability of the data and draw up a conclusion. Second, now our focus is on using the vaccine on an emergency basis. So we would like to have some flexibility in handling this matter. Thank you. Thank you, professors.